Okay, our speaker this morning is Bhikkhu Cintita. A little background. Before entering monastic life, Bhikkhu Cintita earned his PhD in linguistics and a master's in computer science, was a professor of computer science at Southern Illinois University, and worked in the corporate world doing research and development in artificial intelligence, which brought him to Austin, Texas. In 2001, Bhikkhu Cintita retired from his career to devote himself to practice and later teaching, which he has done ever since. He spent 1.5 years at the Tassajara Zen Monastery in California, then ordained as a Zen priest in 2003 at the Austin Zen Center, which he had helped found a few years before. He lived, trained, and taught at the Austin Zen Center for 6 years. In 2009, he traveled to Myanmar, where he was ordained as a Theravada monk. Since returning the following year, he has been affiliated with the Burmese Sitago monasteries in Austin and Minnesota, where he has been engaged in scholarship, teaching, and practice based on the earliest stratum of Buddhist text. He currently resides in Minnesota. Bhikkhu Cintita.
Okay, can you hear me?
Let's see.
Yes.
Okay.
Try it again.
Okay, yeah, let's say you were breaking up a little bit on my end. I hope I don't have a bad connection here. But let me start. Okay, the title of my talk today is Modernity as Cultural Baggage. These terms may be familiar to some of you. We talk about Buddhist modernism, which is a form of Buddhism that resulted from mixing of Asian and Western cultures. Often in the West, we talk about, especially among secular Buddhists, they often refer to complain about cultural baggage in Asian Buddhism, that Buddhism is somehow tainted through the cultures of the West, of the East, as if it wasn't tainted by the cultures of the West. The purpose of this talk is to turn this view of Buddhism on its head and say that cultural baggage, Western or modern cultural baggage, is much more problematic than Asian cultural baggage. Let's start with modernity. I'm going to refer to modernity, not to Western Buddhism, because Buddhist modernity started in Asia, surprisingly enough. And this is particularly well documented in Sri Lanka or Ceylon during the colonial days. When Europeans began showing up in Asia as part of the colonial conditions, a number of them, a lot of the scholarly ones, took a great interest in classical Hindu and Buddhist literature. Some of them studied Pali or Sanskrit, and they were fascinated with these texts, the classical texts. They found them to be very well reasoned, rational, systematic, and especially, I would say, the teachings of the Buddha. But at the same time, they were looking at what Buddhism looked like on the ground in local communities, in temples. And their impression was that it didn't have a lot to do with what the ancient text said. they described the Buddhism, temple Buddhism, as decadent. They thought Buddhism had lapsed into some kind of decadent, what they called cultural baggage, that Buddhism had just been overwhelmed by local cultures. So when they visited a temple, they didn't see much evidence about teachings, not a lot of meditation going on, rather a lot of ceremonies, a lot of rituals, a lot of very unfamiliar things, a lot of hocus pocus going on. And so this led them to the conclusion that Buddhism had become decadent in most parts of Asia. Now, as British, I'll talk mostly about Sri Lanka as an example of a colonial country. As the British assumed control in Sri Lanka, they basically took over all of the institutional life. They ran the schools, they ran the government, and the Sri Lankans, of course, as in many colonial nations, they felt they felt their culture was being disgraced, and that Buddhism was being disgraced. The British actually had a policy of respecting local religions, not trying to push Christianity on people, but that was inevitable because Christian missionaries came with the British, and so the Sri Lankans were largely worried that Buddhism would be eclipsed by this foreign culture, this foreign religion. Over the decades, a lot of the Sri Lankans became modernized. A lot of them received Western educations. They went to Oxford, places like that, and they adapted and began to understand modern culture a little bit better. And they actually began tinkering with Buddhism, a number of them, representing Buddhism. They wanted to show that Buddhism was every bit as good as Christianity and could be as modern and as scientific as Christianity. And so what began to develop was what's often be called Protestant Buddhism in the Sri Lankan context. And this is that it's a Buddhism that, like Protestant faith or Protestant tradition, it's a Buddhism that withdrew from the public sphere, put a lot more emphasis on individual experience and developing spirituality, and eliminating a lot of what in the West would be considered religiosity, which is also the Protestants had largely eliminated from Protestant faith. So you had this emphasis, a change of emphasis from its public presence to its individual presence, and many of the institutions like the Sangha, the monastic institution, rites and rituals, things like this were downplayed. And so this became kind of the face of Buddhism that was presented to the West. Although in small villages and things, Buddhism continued as it had before. One of the remarkable things that happened was in the 1860s and 70s, there were a series of debates between Christian clergy and Buddhist clergy. One of the most famous of these was between a monk named Gunananda and a Christian clergy person named David De Silva, that it was a public debate. There were reporters that actually published the transcript of the debate in a London newspaper. And remarkably, it turned out that the consensus was that Gunananda won the debate hands down. So he was trying to show that Buddhism was scientific and that it accorded with modernity better than Protestant Christianity. And he seemed to convince people. Of course, what he was presenting was a modernized Buddhism that had developed in Sri Lanka in the decades before. This created a big stir among populations in the West and also in Sri Lanka. It finally restored pride in Buddhism among the Sri Lankan population and stirred an interest in Buddhism, a greater interest in Buddhism in the West. For instance, one of the people that read the debate from the London newspaper was an American named Colonel Olcott. He had been an officer in the American Civil War. And he decided he's going to go to Sri Lanka and check Buddhism out. He went to Sri Lanka. He converted to Buddhism. He officially took the refuges and the precepts and had his presence was very meaningful to the Sri Lankans because here was a Westerner endorsing their religion over Christianity. And he became part of the revival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. So this is really the origin of Buddhist modernism in Asia. It is kind of a remaking of Buddhism to meet modern standards. Today, in the West, we still talk about Asian cultural baggage, and people actually kind of experience that. They have that impression. Often when they go to ethnically Asian temples, like Jade Buddha Temple, and discover that there are, these rituals, there's chanting, and they don't see a lot of teaching, although of course, the Jade Temple has EDG and the monastic presence that is very westernized, very open to modern ideas in Buddhism. But often people who get interested in Buddhism in the West are reluctant to visit ethnic temples. So I'm living in an ethnic temple. I'm living in a Burmese monastery here. And people come to my classes, but they will not come to the Burmese ceremonies. So there's a lot of hubris in the West, which has always been a part of the Western interaction with the East through colonialism. Okay, so the thesis of this talk is that the Buddhism that people encountered in Asian temples, that Westerners encountered in Asian temples, was certainly much less decadent than they thought. The second point I want to make is that Buddhist modernism is very decadent or significantly decadent. Not always. It varies quite a bit. A lot of people are, probably most people that go to Jade Buddha Temple are very open to the more Asian interpretation of Buddhism. But finally, that modern cultural baggage is a real problem for the establishment of Buddhism in the West. Okay, so let me talk about modern cultural baggage. It's something, it's difficult for modern people, or particularly for Westerns, to see the modern cultural baggage. It's like a fish being able to see water. They don't notice it. It's just always there. The Buddhist modern culture is something modern people learn at a very early age and internalize and never question. They're not aware that we have this filter that is interpreting ideas from other cultures for us. A couple of symptoms, let me point out a couple of symptoms of modern cultural baggage right off the bat that are very alarming. One thing is that many modern teachers of Buddhism in the West do not teach Buddhism. Many teachers teach ideas that are totally of Western origin and presented as Buddhism and don't realize that they're doing that. A good book that I highly recommend to everybody, this is a wonderful book. It was published in 2008, The Making of Buddhist Modernism. Actually documents this by a scholar, a sociologist who looks at what is being taught as Buddhism by Western teachers and how many of these ideas have their origin in Asia and how many of the ideas that they're teaching have their origin in the West. And it's quite alarming. There seem in Jade Buddha temples and EDG, there seems to be a strong orientation towards looking at Buddhism and studying Buddhism as it occurs in the Asian scriptures. So we tend to be a little away from this tendency. Okay, another symptom is Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher from somewhere in the former Yugoslavia, very, very well known and known probably to some of you. He describes Buddhism as the religion of modern capitalism. Okay, what does he mean by this? This mostly applies to the mindfulness movement, I think. Modern capitalism has atomized people. We are individualists. We are modern neoliberalism basically pushes the idea that each of us individually should consider ourselves to be a corporation, satisfying our own greed, but presenting a public image, a brand to the world, and then living according to these standards. And among people that are most involved in the corporate world, Buddhism or mindfulness practice is very popular because it allows us to deal with the stresses of this situation and with a calmer mind. They basically allow us to fit into to modern capitalism. So that's what I think he meant. And this is a major thrust of Buddhism. Mindfulness, of course, comes from Buddhism, but it's actually become something independent, taking on a life of its own. Okay, so what are the problematic features of modernism? So these problematic features came from Europe. They developed over the centuries in Europe, and at the center of that is almost certainly, and this is what David McMahon in this in this book kind of traces the roots of Buddhist modernism in European history. At the center is the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, of course, was a rejection of the Catholic Church, the institutions of the Catholic Church, the priesthood, the rites and rituals of the Catholic Church. I imagine it being fairly extreme initially. I think Protestant churches have moved back from this somewhat in recent centuries, but the idea was that religion resides not in the church or in society, but in the individual spirituality. This introduced the idea of everybody has a personal relationship with God. It's their business. It doesn't belong in the public sphere. This is even reflected in the US Constitution with the separation of church and state. And this resulted in what followed upon the Protestant Revolution, of course, is the development of science, very much influenced by this way of thinking, because it removed the church from the investigation of the world out there. And then European Enlightenment. And then it was very strongly reflected in European Romanticism, which developed at the beginning of the 19th century, particularly in Germany. And it developed into the idea that each of us has an inner core, an inner self. And this is the site of our creativity, our spirituality, and our ethics, our morality. And that society is a problem for us. Society tries to oppress our inner self. And so we're always in a struggle against society. This kind of cultural change, or this history of cultural change in the West, had no counterpart in Asia until modernity. And so it really is not reflected in Buddhism at all. First of all, Buddhism, the idea of this inner self that is the real you, it's often referred to as the authentic self. And that it's often taught in the romantic tradition that we have an obligation to be true to our authentic selves. It has no reflection in Buddhism. Buddhism teaches non-self. It's just the opposite. The idea that society is a problem is not reflected in Buddhism. The Buddha certainly was critical of a lot of Indian culture and a lot of things that were happening in society as being problematic, but saying that society as a whole was not problematic. He actually created the Buddhist institution, which was the Sangha. Sangha, by the way, in early Buddhism refers to the monastic institution. It doesn't refer to the whole Buddhist community. It seems to be entirely using Sangha to refer to the whole Buddhist community seems to be entirely a product of modernity. In Pali, the whole community would be called the Purisa. The Sangha is totally reserved for the monastic community, with one exception, but I won't get into that. One of the peculiar products of this is that in the West, for many, many people, or in modernity in general, there's a lot of religiosity is found to be very objectionable. So the idea of ritual ceremony, having clergy wearing robes, having churches declaring certain things as being sacred are criticized very roundly, especially from people that scientifically minded people who are very much influenced by the European Enlightenment, people that consider themselves to be rational. This is actually very peculiar because if you take any aspect of religiosity, including all the things, ritual ceremony, clergy and churches refer to religion, but they have their counterparts in secular society. All of these elements are found in secular affairs. You have rituals in birthday parties, in sports events. You have ceremonies in sports events. You have these things in universities. You also have the idea of things as sacred. Celebrities tend to be sacred in modern culture. You certainly have institutions in the secular world. The objection only comes when religion has religiosity. It's okay for anything else to have religiosity, but if a religion or a spiritual tradition has religiosity, that's when people object to religiosity. When we go back to the history of Buddhist modernism reflected in Sri Lanka, we find, that what they were complaining about, what Westerners saw in Asian Buddhism is religiosity. Well, Buddhism's always had religiosity, all of these elements of religiosity since the time of the Buddha. The Buddha was not himself very concerned about these. The religiosity described in the suttas is very minimal, but of course it did explode in the Buddhist tradition over the centuries. I don't worry about the religiosity in Asian Buddhism, the religiosity of the religiosity of Asian Buddhism has had a lot of time to come to terms with what is core Buddhism. The problem is when people looked at the Buddhism, temple Buddhism in the early years, they looked at what was publicly most evident in Buddhism. Now, this would be like an alien, say from the planet Flabobo, who wants to assess the progress of worldlings or earthlings in science. So they decide, they develop a questionnaire and they go around, they land on Earth and then walk around with their questionnaire and they start interviewing people about their ideas about science. They will find a lot of very odd ideas and could easily conclude. So they talk to people on the street and they find people will think that there is no gravity in space, or the phases of the moon are due to the sun's shadow crossing the surface of the moon, or it's cold in winter because it snows and the snow is cold. You get all kinds of wacky ideas. And the reason is you're talking to the wrong people. So basically, there's an adept science. You need to go to the universities, the research centers, things like that, for your poll to see actually what progress science has made in the Western world. You don't talk to the general public, and it's easy to separate the adepts from the public. Not totally accurately, but accurately enough. And that's because we have an institution of science. The scientists are found in universities, research centers, specific place. They also have certain degrees and things. So working scientists will have a much different. So we can talk about an adept science, but then common people kind of support a folk science, and they learn this from each other. A lot of them are very serious about learning science and getting it right. So a lot of lay people have a very good understanding of science, but do not have positions at universities. In fact, a lot of lay people are excellent scientists. Remember that Einstein, when he was coming up with his ideas about relativity, he was an amateur. He didn't have a position at a university. However, he was educated at a university. And so it's the same with Buddhism. Buddhism has an adept Buddhism and a folk Buddhism. So if you talk to Buddhists and ask them about, Buddhist theory, what are the Four Noble Truths, what's the Noble Eightfold Path, what is emptiness, most of them won't be able to answer those things because they're folk Buddhists. They live in a Buddhist culture. They are influenced by Buddhism. They are influenced by the ethical standards of Buddhism, but they are not adept Buddhists. Core Buddhism, what the Buddha gave us is as sophisticated as any modern science. It is systematic. It is very complex. It is very scientific in a lot of ways because the Buddha was very much a cognitive scientist. He understood the human mind so thoroughly. I'm a cognitive scientist. I was trained as a cognitive science, and I am just in awe of what the Buddha understood. And I'm still trying to understand it completely. And so there is an adept Buddhism. Where do you go to look for the adept Buddhism? Well, you go to the Sangha, the monastic order, the order of monks and nuns, which the Buddha established during his life. The Buddha gave us a guidebook that is still in use today called the Vinaya. And if you look at the guidebook, you see that he actually gave us a mission statement. It's very modern in appearance, 10 points, 10 bullet points. But in brief, the monastics, the Buddha expected them to work toward awakening in their own practice life, to maintain the integrity of the Dhamma, and to propagate the Dhamma, to present it to lay people, to create their enthusiasm for Dhamma, and then to teach it to the extent that lay people are willing to absorb it or have the opportunity to absorb it. And so it's much the same. You have to go to the Sangha is what has always maintained the integrity of the Dhamma. Given the complexity of the Dhamma, I at one point concluded there is no Buddhism without the Sangha. It cannot sustain itself without the Sangha. You need a group of people who are practicing 24/7, just as science needs professional scientists. This doesn't mean, by the way, that lay people who don't belong to the Sangha cannot excel in Buddhism, in Buddhist practice, in attainments. In fact, quite the contrary. Many do. But you remember the Einstein case. Einstein excelled without actually belonging to the scholarly community. He was later awarded a PhD, I think, and then given an academic job after his accomplishments became evident. And so we do have people like that. And you also have monks, of course, monks and nuns who are kind of lazy and spend a lot of time sleeping, dozing off, daydreaming. But it's in the Sangha that provides the burning core of Buddhism and makes sure it is sustained. So my advice to Westerners is to be open-minded, to put aside any hubris that we are somehow more capable of understanding what the Buddha taught than Asians are, to study the ancient texts. Our teachers, Buddhism has not really fully penetrated the West, and we are still dependent on Asian teachers. Buddhism will not. We're not on our own in this. We need to learn from Asian teachers. The most important thing is to let Buddhism be Buddhism. Myself, as many of you know, I dedicated my energy to understanding early Buddhism, as close as we can get to what the Buddha taught. We have a lot of textual material that belongs to the early Buddhist stratum. But the later schools I have enormous respect for. I'm very familiar with the Soto Zen school as it's practiced in Japan. Enormous respect of it, except they don't have the Sangha anymore. And the Buddhism going into decay in Japan, I think, as a result of that. Okay, I'm going over time. Let me open it up for questions. Let me point out, I chose this topic because I have a new website, which is easy to find, cintita.org, just my name. And I've just recently finished putting some more content on the website, which can be found through the menu bar under society, talking about the Buddha's teachings on society. And I recommend that because that is very much related to my talk today. I just finished it a couple of days ago and placed it there. Please visit the site and check that out. You'll see a reference also to this book here, there, as well as other books having to do with Buddhist social teachings. Okay, questions. By the way, can you take questions from the audience? I see this
Yes.
array
Yes.
of people that are zooming in. And in the past, they seem to be the ones that ask questions. But audience can ask questions too, as far as I'm concerned.
Felice.
Yes, Felice.
Good morning. This is David.
Oh, okay.
Good morning.
Hi.
Thank you very much. It's good to
Yeah.
see you again. Thank you for
likewise.
thank you
It's
for your teaching. For full disclosure, I'm reading up and listening to your podcasts.
Oh, good.
I'm working my way towards, was Buddhist a biologist?
Oh, okay. You'll want to visit my new website. Kind of all of my materials are there.
So many things
books.
about Buddha that's full of curiosity. My question is, Buddhism, like I said, Northern and Southern Buddhism, wherever it reaches, it seems to adapt to the local culture. But my question is, from my observation, everybody either become religious or follow certain religion. It primarily is because of the self-interest. And between the self-interest and this marketing of the free enterprise. So when I grew up in Burma, my parents are kind of Chinese Buddhists, but it's like you've seen in many temples in Asia. People worship Buddha or temples by burning a lot of gold paper and burning up joss stick, flowers, all kinds of offering.
Yeah.
It's really not Buddhist itself. Buddhist is such a, like you said many times, Buddhism is a practicing. It's a practicing religion, but that's the problem with that. Calling Buddhism religion, we know it's not a true description. Buddhism, because of its belief, does not have a creator. I think Buddhism is more like a mind science. And my question to you is, in that book, since you didn't bring it up, since modern science is trying to understand how our brain and mind really works with MRI and all sorts of later scientific tools to find out what happens to our mind when you meditate deeply. Does the book refer to anything about it's understanding of our own mind? And I'm saying Buddhism, in one way, is this cultivation of our own mind. That's kind of unique practice.
Yeah. You're asking if this book talks about that?
Right.
No, not really. But almost all of my books do. All of my talks. So the question is Buddhism a religion? I usually, you can answer it different ways. It depends on how you define religion. To my mind, I think of Buddhism as a religion, but it's an outlier among religions. And it's an outlier because it does not refer, at least in its original form, does not refer to any higher power, which almost all religions, including most of Hinduism, does. But the idea, so the religiosity, which you find in China, you find the monks and nuns burning money, and there's a lot of ancestor worship. that's connected to Buddhism. So this would belong to what I call folk Buddhism. But and Buddhism has always been very tolerant of folk Buddhism. It mixes in very easily with folk ideas. In Burma, you have of course tree spirits, kind of an animistic worldview that preceded Buddhism, and it gets mixed in with Buddhism. The thing is, often the monastics or people or the adepts, people who really understand Buddhism and who go back to original sources, who know the suttas or the Abhidhamma and things, they will often explain in Burma, they will explain to lay people, when they're doing making offerings for their ancestors. It's kind of a form of that in Burma. They will sometimes explain to lay people, this doesn't work. You can't offer your own good karma to your ancestors. You are the heir of your own deeds, is what the Buddha taught. Your karma is yours. And so there is this difference. What you do not find, I think, in Asian folk Buddhism is significant contradictions with the teaching. So you won't find a kind of a folk cult of Buddhism where they perform animal sacrifice. That would just so contradict the Buddhist way of thinking. So it doesn't occur. It's probably somebody's tried to start such a thing. Some Buddhist out there talking with friends thought it was a good idea, didn't really have an understanding of the core of adept Buddhism, and they might come up with that idea, but it would have been nipped in the bud. Monastics would have had a fit. Probably this tolerance to folk Buddhism, to folk ideas getting mixed in with Buddhism, has probably been an asset to Buddhism, because Buddhism is, of course, the first world religion. It's the one that was able to leave the Indian cultural context and spread through, almost half of the world at one time. And it was because it could be made familiar to people very, very easily. This is happening in the West too. It's made familiar to us. But a lot of the Western ideas, I think, contradict, modern ideas, Protestant romantic ideas, transcendentalism, very much contradict core Buddhist ideas and are much more dangerous. I think what does happen through history, though, is that some folk Buddhist ideas become so prevalent. And of course, the monks and nuns usually grow up as folk Buddhists. They grow up in families, their parents are folk Buddhists. And some of these ideas actually do penetrate into into adept Buddhism, so that people don't distinguish anymore. I think there's probably the least of that in Theravada Buddhism, of the three major schools of Buddhism. But it's there in Theravada Buddhism too, and you find it in Burmese Buddhism. But it's actually a relatively minor influence on. It really doesn't corrupt adept Buddhism in any major way. But adept Buddhism, it has its problems because there are among the adepts a lot of controversy about the proper interpretation of what the Buddha taught and things like this. But Adept Buddhism has retained itself very well. It's significant. I've said that the Sangha is key to this, that there is an institution of the Sangha that the Buddha established. It's interesting that if you look at Buddhist scriptures, they vary quite a bit. The teachings of the Dhamma, the way they're taught in China, is very different from how they're taught in Burma. You have the Mahayana tradition in China and the Theravada, which incorporates very well, incorporates early Buddhism in the Theravada, but it is not limited to early Buddhism. But the scripture that is universal throughout the Buddhist world, the one scripture that's universal, although it has different versions, is the Vinaya, the monastic code. So the Dalai Lama follows the same monastic code that I follow. It's a little different version, but it's basically the same set of rules that have to be adhered to. Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam followed the same Vinaya throughout the Buddhist world, so that's worth pointing out in this regard. There are schools. I think of Pure Land Buddhism as a school that is basically folk Buddhism. It does not adhere to Adept Buddhism very closely. A lot of the new Buddhism in Japan does not adhere to Adept Buddhism very closely. It's a lot like Protestant Christianity in the U.S. Anyway, well, good to see you, David. It's been a long time. I kind of miss my my visits to Houston. I'm up here in Minnesota. It was 18 degrees, a low of 18 degrees last night.
Jeez.
Okay, any other questions?
Any questions here? Yes.
You spoke to the negative side of modernism and Buddhism in the West. What are some positive things that you see about Buddhism's growth in the West?
Did you hear that?
No, I didn't. So somebody will have to repeat it.
Just some positive things about the growth of Buddhism in the West that you see.
Some positive aspects of the growth of Buddhism in the West.
Okay, yeah. So I've been looking at the negative aspects. I think that Western ways of thinking and modern ways of thinking have a lot to contribute to the development of Buddhism. One thing is that there really was no, there are many forms of scholarship, Buddhist scholarship that did not exist until modernity and that have made quite a big impact. One of the things is we can look at the range of Buddhist texts in Asia. Most of these, for instance, the Mahayana Sutras, are attributed to the Buddha. They say this is what the Buddha said, and here we have it. The Lotus Sutra, for instance, was basically a Dhammatak of the Buddha. And modern scholars can look at these various texts that are available in different traditions, and they're very successful at dating them. So the Lotus Sutra actually is at least 1,000 years after the Buddha. It did derive from India, they tell us. There are some scriptures that are attributed to the Buddha and that in Mahayana tradition, they usually think they derive from the Buddha, that were actually composed in China and then given a Sanskrit name. One example is the Brahmajala Sutra in China, which is the basis of the Bodhisattva code of ethics. So it has a Sanskrit name, but people, scholars have looked at this and say, this was written in China. There are all kinds of little hints. So this is very valuable. One of the things I do in my research, especially since I have a background in science and in cognitive science in particular, is I use modern science when I look at the teachings of the Buddha, which are very much cognitive. They are, completely. They are. The Buddha did not follow the scientific method, but he did talk about the cognition in terms of our experience and what cognitive factors result in what cognitive factors, and describe these processes. And often there is a lot of debate about how the Buddhist teachings should be interpreted. Some of this debate can be on very major issues. What I do in my scholarship is I weigh in on these debates. I'm kind of a natural problem solver. I look at this is what people are arguing about. This is what the Buddha said. Who's interpreting this correctly, or does it need a new interpretation? And I bring modern cognitive science into this because if what the Buddha is describing follows the process, 1, 2, 3, that is also documented in modern science, I say that is a very strong evidence for the correctness of a particular interpretation. And so the Western science has been very valuable, and I think will become increasingly valuable in the future. Not a lot of people are doing Buddhist scholarship in the modern sense, but a lot of that now is happening in Asia. Most of it is happening in Asia, in China, in Japan, somewhat in India. But there are people like Japanese scholars who learn Pali and read these ancient scriptures, the Pali scriptures, which were barely available historically in Japan. So I think modern ways of thinking have a way of helping. I'm a great believer in science, and I think that science has a way. It will take strong positions on things, but science develops and will look for alternatives, and will be able to kind of turn things on its head. And I think science scholarship has a lot to offer the future development of Buddhism, and a greater understanding of what the Buddha taught. The Sangha has not been entirely successful in preserving the integrity of the Dhamma. There are points in which I think it goes astray.
Okay, any last minute quick questions?
If there's a question
Online?
in the chat. There's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. There's a chat question.
Yeah. Okay. I'm on the go and off camera. I heard you say that Western Buddhists do not teach Buddhism. What exactly do you refer to? I'm saying there are Western teachers who do not teach Buddhism, but what they present it as Buddhism. They're usually meditation teachers. They present often what is taught as meditation is largely of modern origin. What is taught as Buddhist meditation, there it has we do have modern teaching that you cannot not find really in the as what the Buddha taught. But there are teachers. There are a lot of teachers who are very, very well versed in scripture. Joseph Goldstein, I would say, is one of those. There are a lot of teachers that teach a combination of Buddhism, Buddhist teachings, kind of mixed in with a lot of modern or Western teachings. But there are teachers out there who you cannot actually find anything they're teaching that's of Asian origin. You don't find it. This is what David McMahon in this book discovered. The Tanisaro Bhikkhu, some of you will know that name, who's an American monk, very strong practitioner, wonderful scholar. He attributes European Romanticism. He says it's the source of the problem. Most people don't know what European Romanticism is, but it does have a huge influence in European intellectual history. He actually initially wrote an essay called "Romancing the Buddha." Criticized it. He starts off by saying a lot of people in the West who start studying Buddhism are amazed how familiar so many of the ideas seem to be. And he says, that's because they are familiar. We have them in our culture. Then he wrote a book on this. And he actually, half the book is just studying the origins of European Romanticism, looking at these European philosophers like Schleiermacher. Anyway, this is the case. What they're teaching is valuable. It's not that they're not doing a service, but it is taught. What they're teaching is something that is very familiar in Western thought, and probably might be said to be, close to American transcendentalism, which of course has a lot of wonderful qualities. But American transcendentalism is about the individual. The individual is the source of all things spiritual. It's a Protestant idea. It's associated with Emerson, I guess, is the most closely Thoreau. So anyway, it is present in modern Buddhism, but of course there are a lot of modern Buddhists who don't teach that, including me. I'm a product of modernism, and but have have realized that Buddhism has a life of its own, something that's quite different from modernism, and that should be respected, and that really you go deep into Buddhism when you're willing to open your mind to that. We will always be modernists if we grew up as modernists, and we'll have a way of thinking in modern terms about Buddhism, but realize that has limits, serious limits.
Okay, thank you. I think we're out of time. If everybody would please stand. Three bows. Namo Buddha, Namo Dhamma, Namo Sangha. Namo Buddha, Namo Dhamma, Namo Sangha. Namo Buddha, Namo Dhamma, Namo Sangha. Thank you all. Thank you, Bhikkhu.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.